Hello, students. Yet again, this is Professor Martin. Just continuing our discussion of the presidency, and in this case, I wanted to deal with that question of being commander-in-chief, one of the five major responsibilities of the president that we talked about, in the context of, again, one of those questions of delegated power, because it happens to be, within the last couple of weeks, a very important concern. One of the things that you're going to see a president need in the context of a large enough conflict is that the resources and the ability to create more supply of the United States in the context of fighting wars will sometimes need to be harnessed beyond just letting the free market do it. This has been something that you've seen before. And where you've seen it before is something, please go ahead and remember this name because we will use it again, and you will hear it again. The Defense Production Act. That is, the Defense Production Act. Now, this is about 70 years old, so you may or may not have heard of it before. But in some ways, it is going to be a critical tool that, although it's not used as much anymore, could wind up being particularly important now. What was it originally designed to do? Partially, it was to intervene in the economy in selected industries, so not the entire economy as a whole, but focused ones, to try and ramp up production and providing goods and services which were considered necessary for the United States during a time of war, or more generally, not necessarily in a time of war, but also just year to year, essential national security purposes. So it's a way of taking the US economy or parts of it and forcing them or mandating them to produce more of certain kinds of products or switch to manufacturing certain kinds of products for the purposes of national security, for fighting a war. Now, this had various reasons why this actually came about. The most obvious one, because it was passed in 1950, this is during the context of the Korean War. This was when you had a fight going on between South and North Korea, respectively non-communist and communist, and the United States was not necessarily doing well during part of that time. There was a feeling that the resources of the country needed to be urgently mobilized for the purposes of more manpower, more supplies, more equipment, and therefore that what you're going to do is have a certain amount of needed military and civilian goods be things that companies will be producing instead of what they would normally produce. So it's a harnessing of that power to create things that the military needed. This has come up as something important here and there since then. Not all of them in ways that you might have usually thought. One of the things that actually you've probably seen is ones that just had questions to do with certain pieces of technology that the government thought were important. So, for example, many years ago, the first of these titles in the measure was to give priority to certain kinds of tools that the armed forces needed. So, for example, you had a situation where the main tank that the United States has used for the last 30 years, the N1 Abrams tank, when it was first being built, it was running into some problems because it was being built by a company, Chrysler at the time, that was financially not doing terribly well. So there was a way in which that act was used to make sure that they received a support designation that would allow them to continue building those particular units that the armed forces needed. Sometimes it's not as directly related to the military. An example, when you saw the question of a transfer of power between Clinton and Bush II, they actually used that act to provide emergency electrical power to the likes of California. If you're not from California, around that time, 20 years ago, what you might have noticed is rolling blackouts where there was a severe lack of electricity, and therefore you had a situation where many essential services, including, so President Clinton and President Bush believed, the kind that could potentially jeopardize any military mobilization. So it's been something that is a little bit kind of eclectic in terms of what it's used for. Sometimes it's also going to be directly providing money. So, for example, guaranteeing certain loans to different industries to make sure delivery or discovery of different kinds of essential materials for wartime actually are found quicker and refined quicker. But the reason why it's important nowadays and why it is a test of the kinds of tools the government needs at present, the executive branch, through its national security powers, might need at present, actually has to do with what you are currently living through, which is to say, the coronavirus COVID-19 crisis. Obviously, at this point, you've seen and have witnessed in your own lives a great deal of national slowdown of activity in general, but especially the economic kind, as more people stay home, as more people stay home alone, as more and more cases of infection with the COVID-19 virus are actually discovered. But that means that there are certain things that we've started seeing some shortages of. As you're all probably aware, that especially includes toilet paper, much to many of our chagrins as we try and go and look around in Walmart. But there's a more serious one that actually has medical importance beyond simply what individual consumers have. And that is to say, for example, ventilators, respirators, face masks. In other words, the kind of things that doctors and nurses and patients all need right now in a hurry, and that they're in rapidly reducing supply. One of the things, therefore, that you've had is a call for the president to use this delegated power by Congress from back in the day. What are they asking the president to do in this instance? When I say they, I mean different state governors, different legislators in Capitol Hill, different businesses, NGOs, journalists, etc. Activate it and thereby use it to start, for example, manufacturing two things. First of all, especially more face masks. Second of all, especially more ventilator and respirator equipment. This is the kind of thing that would especially hit on the garment industry and on the actually automobile industry, funnily enough. I think you could probably guess about the garment industry with face masks, but the automobile industry, I think what the key connection there is so much of what an automobile does depends on fans and, well, basically the kind of things that make ventilators and respirators run. And so there would be an attempt to actually have them directly produce these items as the cost of national security, basically. Now, one of the things I will probably have you take a look at in your written assignments is, does this constitute a national emergency that justifies that sort of militarily based kind of aid and militarily based kind of action? Because at the moment, or at least within the last couple of days, you have had President Trump not necessarily wanting to actually fully engage what the Defense Production Act would actually do. And that's the case in a couple of ways. He's provided at different occasions at least three reasons why he does not believe that it is necessary or should be done. So please go ahead and note these carefully because they're the kind that may show up on a later sort of test assignment or at the very least another after reading assignment that we do in the future. The first case, he believes that no, that's for a worst case scenario. Second, he believes that it is the states, namely governors, that should be finding ways to have U.S. companies do this. And the third, that actually many U.S. companies are already doing this, and they don't necessarily have to be told. And there are a number that have. If you look at General Motors and Ford, they've reportedly begun looking at production of this kind. So the question that the president is raising, leaving aside your impression of the president or his crisis management or not, is this specifically a task that you believe a president, any president under these circumstances, should take as the commander in chief? Is this something, in other words, that is sufficiently related to national security that as the CNC, the president is within the president's authority to actually go ahead and use the delegated power from Congress the president has for this reason? Now, I think you probably could get a sense that a lot of people would say, yes, by all means, whatever it takes to actually accomplish the goal of keeping the country safer and by dint of healthier, safer. However, the questions the president raises, independent of who raised them, they do raise some interesting points. First of all, how much can be done with voluntary help and voluntary action by U.S. businesses and individuals? What we're seeing so far is actually quite a bit. There is also the case of how do we know this is a worst case scenario? Is there a worst that could come when the entire country is boarded up as it is? Are there steps that we need to wait to take until it's worse? What is qualified as worse? And most of all, I think this is the most important thing that the president raises that you may want to consider carefully. He says governors and states should be finding ways to have companies make those goods. What, in other words, this is bringing us directly back to our discussion of federalism, directly back to the question of what should states be responsible for and what should the national government be responsible for. It may sound like a little bit of a strange thing to be debating or bringing up in the context of a disease crisis like the one at present, but I think the president would argue, and I think if he does, you could see his point, that at that time there's no better time to actually be having that conversation, because if this is what you're going to need government power for the most, therefore it stands to reason you need to look most carefully at what it is you're asking government to do and who it is you're asking to do it. So just to give you some ideas about that. A couple of other things just wanted to outline in your notes before we moved on. We looked at some of the questions of the chief executive's function, as one of them being the CEO of government. Now, interesting thing here is you've probably seen a little bit of an element of this in our readings and lecture before, namely, in this case, appointing things like judges. Actually, the president is responsible for many different federal officers being appointed, ambassadors, ministers, people in the cabinet, people who are sub-cabinet level officers. In many cases, you're talking hundreds, if not a few thousand sorts of personnel who need official nomination and then official approval. And we'll talk a little bit about what that kind of staff looks like. Suffice to say, you've probably heard of some of them before. The Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of Defense, which actually has changed hands several times. That's Mark Esper at the moment. But it's important noting what those are in the president's team. Secretary of State, Treasury, Defense, and also Attorney General are among the oldest of the cabinet offices, and therefore they're usually those that are most prominent in the media and some of the most powerful. So, as the president is judged by how the president handles the president's responsibilities, this is the kind of team that is ultimately going to carry those goals out and actually see if the president's prerogatives can be carried out through the normal government bureaucracy that serves you day to day.